This is why everyone is talking about Venezuela and why you should be paying closer attention. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024. That was the day Nicolas Maduro was declared the winner of Venezuela's presidential election, securing a third term in a vote that, depending on who you ask, was either a triumph of democratic resilience or a sham so brazen it made a mockery of the very concept of free elections. The official result? Maduro with 51.2% of the vote, his opponent, Edmundo Gonzalez, trailing at 44.2%. The streets of Caracas erupted, not in celebration, but in protest. Opposition figures cried fraud, the U.S. State Department called the election neither free nor fair, and within days, the European Union, the OAS, and a dozen Latin American governments had joined the chorus of condemnation. Now, if you're like most people, you probably glanced at the headlines, shrugged, and moved on. Another election in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map, another autocrat clinging to power, another round of Western finger wagging. But this isn't just another story about a failing state in America's backyard. This is a geopolitical earthquake in slow motion, one that could reshape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere and, by extension, the world. And if you think the U.S. response to this crisis is about democracy, or human rights, or even oil, you're missing the bigger picture. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of power, resources, and great power competition, from the fall of the Soviet Union to the rise of China, from the wars in the Middle East to the quiet but relentless action of Russian influence in Latin America. And what I can tell you is Venezuela isn't just a country. It's a battleground. A proxy. A test case for whether the United States can still enforce its will in its own hemisphere or whether a new multipolar order is emerging, one where Washington's writ no longer runs unchallenged. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the way this plays out will determine whether we're heading toward a new Cold War, a hot conflict, or something even more, a world where American power is openly defied, and no one is quite sure what happens then. So let's start with the story they're telling you. Then, let's unpack what's really going on. The official democracy under siege. Here's the version of events you've probably heard. Venezuela, once the wealthiest country in Latin America, has been ruined by 2 decades of socialist mismanagement under Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro. Hyperinflation, mass emigration, crumbling infrastructure, and a humanitarian crisis have turned what should be a regional powerhouse into a failed state. The 2024 election was supposed to be a turning point, a chance for Venezuelans to reject Maduro's authoritarianism and restore democracy. Instead, the regime rigged the vote, suppressed the opposition, and stole another 6 years in power. The evidence? Well, for starters, the opposition claimed that its own exit polls showed Gonzalez winning by a landslide, 59% to Maduro's 31%. The Carter Center, which monitored the election, called the results highly questionable. The U.S. government, which had been cautiously optimistic about a fair vote, quickly reversed course, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken declaring that the process was neither free nor fair, and we do not recognize the results. The EU and the OAS followed suit, demanding a full audit. Meanwhile, Maduro's government arrested opposition leaders, shut down protests with lethal force, and expelled diplomats from countries that refused to accept the outcome. On the surface, it looks like a straightforward case of electoral fraud. The kind of thing we've seen before in places like Belarus or Zimbabwe. But here's the problem with this: it's not wrong, exactly. The election was rigged. The opposition was suppressed. The results are almost certainly fraudulent. But if you think this is just about Venezuela, or even just about Latin America, you're missing the forest for the trees. Because this isn't just about Maduro. It's about what happens when a declining superpower tries to enforce its will in a world where its dominance is no longer guaranteed. It's about what happens when 2 rising powers, China and Russia, see an opportunity to weaken that superpower by propping up its enemies. And it's about what happens when the rules of the game change, and no one is quite sure who's making them anymore. Let me tell you what's really going on. The hidden geopolitical chessboard. First, let's talk about the numbers. The opposition's claim that Gonzalez won 59% of the vote is almost certainly true. Independent polling before the election consistently showed Maduro trailing by double digits, with some surveys putting him as low as 20%. The regime knew it was going to lose. So it did what authoritarian regimes it cheated. But here's the thing, it didn't just cheat a little. It cheated badly. The kind of cheating that leaves fingerprints all over the evidence. The Venezuelan Electoral Authority, the CNE, released only 30% of the voting tallies, a fraction of what's required for transparency. When the opposition managed to obtain 80% of the tally sheets, they showed González winning by a margin of nearly 2 million votes. The CNE's response? To declare Maduro the winner without releasing the full data. That's not an election. That's a coup in slow motion. But here's where it gets interesting. Because while the fraud was blatant, the international response has been uneven. The US, the EU, and most of Latin America have condemned the election. But China and Russia? They've done the opposite. Beijing was the first major power to congratulate Maduro, calling the election smooth and successful. Moscow followed suit, with Putin sending a warm message of support. And that's not an accident. Because for China and Russia, Venezuela isn't a democracy in crisis. It's an opportunity. Let's talk about why. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. For decades, that oil flowed north to the United States, which was Venezuela's largest customer. But after Chavez came to power in 1999, he began reorienting Venezuela's economy away from the US and toward China and Russia. By the time Maduro took over in 2013, Venezuela was already deep in debt to Beijing, which had loaned the country over $60 billion in exchange for future oil shipments. Russia, meanwhile, had become Venezuela's largest arms supplier, selling it everything from fighter jets to surface-to-air missiles. When the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela in 2019, cutting it off from global financial markets, China and Russia doubled down. Beijing restructured Venezuela's debt, while Moscow sent in military advisors and Wagner Group mercenaries to prop up Maduro's regime. Today, Venezuela is effectively a client state of both powers, a foothold in the Western Hemisphere that allows them to project influence right under America's nose. And that's the key. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader contest for global dominance. The US sees Latin America as its sphere of influence, a region where it has historically called the shots. But China and Russia see it as a battleground, a place where they can challenge American hegemony without risking direct confrontation. And Venezuela? Venezuela is the perfect test case. If Maduro can survive this crisis, if he can weather the sanctions, the protests, the international condemnation, then China and Russia will have proven that they can prop up a regime in America's backyard without the US being able to do anything about it. And if that happens, it won't just be Venezuela. It'll be Nicaragua. It'll be Cuba. It'll be Bolivia. It'll be a slow-motion erosion of American influence in a region that Washington has considered its own for over a century. That's what's really at stake here. And that's why everyone is talking about Venezuela. The great power, how we got here. To understand why this matters, you have to go back to the end of the Cold War. For most of the 20th century, the US and the Soviet Union competed for influence in Latin America, with Washington backing right-wing dictatorships and Moscow supporting leftist revolutions. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, the US emerged as the world's sole superpower. For a brief moment, it looked like liberal democracy and free market capitalism had won. Francis Fukuyama famously declared it the end of history. But history didn't end. It just went on pause. Because while the US was busy invading Iraq and Afghanistan, China was rising. And Russia, humiliated by its post-Soviet decline, was waiting for a chance to reassert itself. By the time the US realized what was happening, it was too late. China had become the world's second-largest economy, and Russia had rebuilt its military. And both countries had set their sights on Latin America, a region that the US had taken for granted. The first sign of trouble came in 2008, when Russia sent warships to the Caribbean for the first time since the Cold War. Then came the military bases, Russia in Nicaragua, China in Argentina. Then the loans, China lending billions to Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia in exchange for access to their resources. Then the arms sales, Russia selling advanced weaponry to Venezuela, including S-300 air defense systems that could threaten U.S. aircraft. And then came the coup in 2019. When Juan Guaidó, the leader of Venezuela's opposition, declared himself interim president with the backing of the US and over 50 other countries, it looked like Maduro's days were numbered. The Trump administration imposed crippling sanctions, froze Venezuela's assets, and even hinted at military intervention. But Maduro didn't fall. Why? Because China and Russia stepped in. Beijing kept buying Venezuelan oil, while Moscow sent in Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Maduro's inner circle. That was the moment when the rules of the game changed. Because for the first time since the Cold War, the US was forced to confront a reality it had long: its dominance in Latin America was no longer guaranteed. And if it wanted to maintain its influence, it would have to fight for it. Fast forward to 2024. The US has spent the last 5 years trying to strangle Venezuela's economy, hoping that sanctions would force Maduro out. But instead of collapsing, the regime has adapted. It's found new buyers for its oil: China, India, even some European refiners willing to look the other way. It's diversified its economy, selling gold and other minerals to Russia and Iran. And it's used the crisis to tighten its grip on power, arresting opponents, shutting down dissent, and turning Venezuela into a de facto police state. And now, with the 2024 election, the US is back to square one. Because Maduro isn't just surviving. He's winning. And every day he stays in power, he proves that the US can enforce its will in its own hemisphere. That's the real story here. And it's a story that has implications far beyond Venezuela. The military: how close are we to conflict? Now, let's talk about the military angle. Because if you think this is just a diplomatic spat, you're not paying attention. The US has a long history of intervening in Latin America. From the Bay of Pigs to the invasion of AMA, from the coup in Chile to the drug wars in Colombia, the US has never hesitated to use force when it felt its interests were threatened. And Venezuela? Venezuela is the ultimate test case for whether that era is over. Right now, the US has a significant military presence in the region. There are over 1,000 US troops in Colombia, a key ally that shares a border with Venezuela. There are US naval assets in the Caribbean, including the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group, which has been conducting exercises in the region. And there are US special forces operating in neighboring countries, training local forces and gathering intelligence. But here's the US isn't just preparing for a potential intervention. It's deterring one. Because if Maduro falls, the question isn't just who replaces him. It's who helps replace him. And if China and Russia decide to intervene militarily to prop up Maduro, the US could find itself in a direct confrontation with two nuclear-armed powers in its own backyard. That's not hyperbole. Russia has already sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela. China has conducted joint military exercises with the Venezuelan armed forces. And both countries have warned the US that any military intervention would be met with serious consequences. Now, I'm not saying we're on the brink of World War III. But I am saying that the risk of miscalculation is higher than it's been in decades. Because the US is used to operating in a world where it can do whatever it wants in Latin America. But that world is gone. And if the US tries to remove Maduro by force, it could find itself in a conflict it can't win. Let's look at the numbers. Venezuela's military is one of the largest in Latin America, with over 120,000 active duty troops and a well-equipped air force. It's also battle-hardened, having fought against Colombian guerrillas and drug cartels for years. And it's backed by Russia and China, which have supplied it with advanced weaponry, including anti-aircraft systems, drones, and electronic warfare capabilities. The US, of course, has the most powerful military in the world. But that doesn't mean it can win a war in Venezuela. Because this wouldn't be a quick, clean intervention like AMA in 1989. This would be a prolonged, messy conflict, with urban warfare, guerrilla resistance, and the risk of regional spillover. And even if the US succeeded in removing Maduro, it would then have to deal with the aftermath: a collapsed state, a humanitarian crisis, and the very real possibility of a civil war. That's why the hawks in Washington who are calling for military action are being dangerously naive. Because they're assuming that the US can just walk in, remove Maduro, and walk out. But history tells us that's not how these things work. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, these weren't just military failures. They were strategic disasters. And Venezuela could be even worse. Because this time, the US wouldn't just be fighting a weak, isolated regime. It would be fighting a regime backed by two of the world's most powerful countries. And that changes everything. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Now, let's talk about the politics. Because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about elections. And right now, Venezuela is becoming a major issue in the 2024 US presidential race. For the Biden administration, Venezuela is a no-win situation. On one hand, the US can't afford to let Maduro consolidate power, because that would be a victory for China and Russia in America's backyard. On the other hand, the US can't afford to escalate the situation, because that could lead to a military confrontation that no one wants. So what's the administration doing? It's trying to thread the needle. It's imposing targeted sanctions on Maduro and his inner circle. It's supporting the opposition. It's working with allies in the region to isolate Venezuela diplomatically. But it's also avoiding any action that could be seen as a provocation. That's a smart strategy. But it's also a fragile one. Because the moment Maduro does something that crosses a red line, like arresting Guaido, or cracking down even harder on protests, the pressure on Biden to act will become overwhelming. And if he doesn't act, he'll be accused of weakness by Republicans. But if he does act, he risks starting a war. And that's where the politics get really interesting. Because Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy issue. It's a domestic one. And it's playing out in key swing states like Florida, where there are over 200,000 Venezuelan Americans, many of whom fled Maduro's regime and are demanding action. In 2020, Biden won Florida by just over 3 percentage points. In 2024, the state is even more competitive. And if the administration is seen as soft on Maduro, it could lose the support of Venezuelan American voters, a bloc that could decide the election. That's why you're seeing Republicans like Marco Rubio and Rick Scott calling for tougher action. It's why Trump, in a recent rally, accused Biden of letting Maduro get away with murder. And it's why the administration is walking a tightrope, trying to appear tough without actually doing anything that could backfire. But this isn't just about Florida. It's about the broader narrative of American decline. Because if Maduro survives, it will be seen as another sign that the US is losing its grip on the world. And that's a narrative that both parties are desperate to avoid. The what happens next? So where do we go from here? Let's look at the possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, the international pressure works. The US, the EU, and Latin American allies manage to force Maduro into a negotiated transition. He agrees to new elections, supervised by international observers, and steps down in exchange for immunity. Venezuela begins the long process of rebuilding, with massive international aid and investment. The US lifts sanctions, and Venezuela's oil starts flowing again. This is the outcome everyone says they want. But it's also the least likely. Because Maduro has no incentive to step down. He knows that if he leaves power, he could end up in The Hague, facing charges of crimes against humanity. And China and Russia have no incentive to let him go, because that would mean losing their foothold in the region. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. In this scenario, Maduro survives. He cracks down on the opposition, arrests key leaders, and consolidates power. The US and its allies impose more sanctions, but they're not enough to force him out. China and Russia continue to prop up his regime, buying Venezuelan oil and providing military support. Venezuela becomes a permanent pariah state, like North Korea or Iran, a country that's permanently destabilizing the region but never quite collapsing. The opposition fractures, some leaders flee into exile, others are co-opted, and the rest are jailed or worse. The US is left with either accept this new reality or escalate in ways that could trigger a direct confrontation with Russia and China. And that's where things get really dangerous. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a testing ground for a new kind of great power competition. The Russians and Chinese aren't there out of charity. They're there because Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, straddles the Caribbean, and offers a strategic perch just a few hundred miles from the US mainland. Moscow and Beijing see Maduro as a useful idiot, sure, but also as a partner in their broader campaign to erode American influence. And they're playing a long game. Let me explain why this matters for US military strategy. The Pentagon has spent the last 2 decades fighting counterinsurgencies in the Middle East, but the next war, if there is one, won't look like Iraq or Afghanistan. It'll be a hybrid conflict, fought in the gray zone between peace and war, where the lines between state and non-state actors blur. Venezuela is a perfect case study for this. The Russians have already deployed Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan forces, and in 2019, 2 Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed in Caracas in a show of force. The Chinese, meanwhile, have built a satellite tracking station in the country and are deepening their military cooperation, including joint naval exercises in the Caribbean. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is not prepared for this kind of challenge. The Southern Command, which oversees military operations in Latin America, has been chronically underfunded and overlooked. The last time the US seriously considered a military intervention in Venezuela was in 2019, when Trump reportedly asked his advisors why the US couldn't just invade. The answer, of course, was that it would be a logistical nightmare. Venezuela's military is larger and better equipped than most people realize, with Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, Chinese drones, and a network of irregular forces loyal to the regime. And even if the US could topple Maduro, what then? The country is a powder keg. The last thing the US needs is another Iraq-style occupation, especially with China and Russia waiting in the wings to exploit the chaos. But the military implications go beyond Venezuela itself. If Maduro survives, it sends a message to every autocrat in the you can defy the US and get away with it. Look at Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega has jailed opposition leaders and aligned himself with Moscow. Look at Cuba, which has been under US sanctions for decades but still manages to punch above its weight by hosting Russian intelligence operations. Look at Bolivia, where Evo Morales' socialist government flirted with China and Russia before being ousted in a coup. The US has spent the last century treating Latin America as its backyard, but that era is ending. The region is fragmenting, and the old rules no longer apply. So what does the US do? The Biden administration's current approach, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and half-hearted support for the opposition, isn't working. But the alternatives are all bad. A full-scale military intervention is off the table, not just because of the logistical challenges but because the American public has no appetite for another war. Covert action, like the failed 2020 operation to capture Maduro, is risky and could backfire spectacularly. And doubling down on sanctions would only push Venezuela further into the arms of China and Russia, which are more than happy to buy its oil at a discount and sell it weapons in return. The most likely outcome, as I see it, is that the US will continue to muddle through, hoping that Maduro's regime collapses under its own weight. But that's a dangerous gamble. Venezuela's economy is in freefall, but the regime has proven remarkably resilient. It survives by controlling the food supply, jailing dissenters, and relying on external patrons. And as long as China and Russia are willing to prop it up, Maduro isn't going anywhere. This brings me to the bigger picture. Venezuela is a microcosm of a global shift in power. The US is no longer the undisputed hegemon it was in the 1990s. China is rising, Russia is resurgent, and the post-Cold War order is crumbling. The question isn't whether the US can still project power, it's whether it can do so without triggering a wider conflict. And in Venezuela, that question is being put to the test. Let's not forget the human cost of this geopolitical chess game. While Washington and Moscow trade barbs, millions of Venezuelans are suffering. The country's healthcare system has collapsed, malnutrition is rampant, and more than 7 million people have fled the country since 2015. The US has taken in hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan refugees, but the crisis is far from over. And if Maduro survives, the exodus will only accelerate, putting pressure on neighboring countries like Colombia and Brazil, which are already struggling to cope with the influx. So where does this leave us? The US has three options, none of them good. The first is to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and try to contain the damage, which would mean working with allies to mitigate the refugee crisis and prevent Venezuela from becoming a full-blown narco-state. The second is to escalate, either through more aggressive sanctions or covert action, which risks provoking a response from Russia and China. The third is to try to negotiate a face-saving exit for Maduro, which would require offering him and his cronies some kind of immunity deal, a bitter pill for the US to swallow, but perhaps the least bad option. The problem is that none of these options address the root cause of the fact that Venezuela's political system is broken beyond repair. The opposition is divided, the military is loyal to Maduro, and the economy is in ruins. Even if Maduro were to step down tomorrow, the country would still face years of instability. And that's the real tragedy of Venezuela. It's not just a geopolitical battleground, it's a cautionary tale about what happens when a country's institutions collapse and the world's great powers treat it as a pawn in their own games. In the end, Venezuela's fate will be decided not just by what happens in Caracas, but by what happens in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. And that's why everyone is talking about it. Because this isn't just about one failed state in Latin America. It's about the future of American power, the limits of great power competition, and whether the international order can survive the 21st century. And right now, the signs aren't encouraging. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's domestic political crisis isn't just a story of authoritarianism versus democracy, it's a story of institutional decay so complete that even the opposition can't agree on what comes in. Take the 2024 presidential election, for instance. The opposition, led by figures like Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, has spent years trying to unify under a single banner, only to fracture over personal ambitions and ideological differences. Machado, a hardline free-market liberal, won the opposition primary in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote, but she was immediately disqualified by the Maduro-controlled Supreme Court, a move so predictable it might as well have been scripted. Her replacement, Gonzalez, a former diplomat with little charisma, was essentially a compromise candidate, and even then, factions within the opposition grumbled that he was too soft on Maduro. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's opposition isn't just fighting Maduro, it's fighting itself. The same infighting that doomed the 2019 interim government when Juan Guaido's parallel administration collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions is still alive and well. The opposition strategy has oscillated between mass protests, international pressure, and backroom deals, but none of it has worked because the underlying problem isn't just Maduro's grip on power. It's that Venezuela's political class, on both sides, has spent 2 decades dismantling the institutions that could have held them accountable. The judiciary, the electoral council, the military, all of them have been hollowed out and repurposed as tools of control. Even if Maduro were to vanish tomorrow, the system he built would still be there, waiting for the next strongman to take the reins. Let me explain why this matters for the broader geopolitical picture. The US and its allies have spent years treating Venezuela as a binary: Maduro is the villain, the opposition is the hero, and regime change is the solution. But that's a fantasy. The reality is that Venezuela's crisis is structural, and no amount of sanctions or diplomatic pressure can fix a system where the military's loyalty is bought with drug trafficking routes, where the National Assembly is a rubber stamp body, and where the central bank prints money so fast that inflation hit 1,000,000% in 2018. The opposition's inability to govern even in exile isn't just a tactical failure, it's a symptom of a country where the state has ceased to function as anything other than a mechanism for plunder. So what happens next? Let's run through the scenarios, because this is where things get really messy. First, there's the status quo. Maduro survives, the opposition remains divided, and the country continues its slow-motion collapse. This is the most likely outcome in the short term, and it's the one that Washington, Moscow, and Beijing are all quietly preparing for. The US will keep its sanctions in place, Russia will keep selling Venezuela arms and oil, and China will keep extending credit lines in exchange for access to Venezuela's oil and gold reserves. The refugee crisis will worsen, Colombia and Brazil will harden their borders, and the EU will issue strongly worded statements about human rights. Maduro will continue to play the victim of imperialism, using U.S. sanctions as an excuse for his own failures, while his inner circle figures like Diosdado Cabello and Tarek El Aissami will keep enriching themselves through corruption and illicit trade. This is the path of least resistance, and it's the one Venezuela has been on for the past decade. Second, there's the regime collapse scenario. This is the one the opposition dreams of, but it's also the most dangerous. If Maduro were to lose control either through a military coup, a popular uprising, or a sudden health crisis, the power vacuum would be catastrophic. The military, which is deeply factionalized, would likely splinter, with some units loyal to Maduro, others to regional strongmen, and others to whoever can pay them the most. The colectivos, the armed pro-government gangs, would go rogue, turning Caracas into a war zone. And the opposition, which has no coherent plan for governing, would struggle to fill the void. We saw a glimpse of this in 2019, when Guaido's attempt to rally the military failed because the generals knew there was no viable alternative to Maduro. The risk here isn't just chaos, it's that Venezuela could become a failed state on the scale of Libya or Somalia, with armed groups, foreign mercenaries, and criminal syndicates carving up the country. Third, there's the negotiated transition. This is the scenario that the US and the EU have been pushing for, but it's also the least likely. For Maduro to step down, he'd need guarantees immunity from prosecution, a share of power for his allies, and a way to protect his wealth. The opposition, meanwhile, would have to accept that they can't just purge the Chavista elite, because the military and the bureaucracy are too entrenched. The problem is that neither side trusts the other. Maduro remembers what happened to Muammar Gaddafi after he gave up his weapons, and the opposition remembers what happened to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua after they agreed to elections in 1990, only to claw their way back to power decades later. Any deal would require a third party, like the UN or the Vatican, to broker it, but even then, the odds of success are slim. The last time Venezuela tried this, during the 2019 Oslo talks, Maduro used the negotiations as a stalling tactic while he consolidated power. Here's the thing that keeps me up: none of these scenarios end with Venezuela becoming a stable democracy. The best-case outcome is a managed decline, where Maduro's regime slowly withers under sanctions and economic pressure, and the country limps along as a dysfunctional petrostate. The worst-case outcome is a full-blown civil war, with foreign powers Russia, China, the US, and even Iran backing different factions. And the most likely outcome is something in a slow, grinding collapse where Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis, a black hole in the heart of Latin America that sucks in resources, attention, and refugees for decades to come. The establishment narrative in Washington is that Venezuela is a problem to be solved, but that's the wrong way to think about it. Venezuela is a symptom of a larger disease: the erosion of the post-Cold War order, the rise of authoritarian capitalism, and the failure of liberal democracy to deliver on its promises. Maduro isn't just a dictator, he's a product of a system where the US has spent decades propping up friendly strongmen, where China and Russia see Latin America as a battleground for influence, and where the international community has no real tools to address state failure beyond sanctions and empty rhetoric. So why is everyone talking about Venezuela? Because it's a test case for the 21st century. Can the US still shape events in its own hemisphere, or is its influence waning? Can China and Russia be countered without triggering a new Cold War? And can the international community do anything to prevent a country from sliding into chaos, or is it too late once the institutions have collapsed? Venezuela isn't just a crisis, it's a preview of what's coming for other fragile states, from Haiti to Sudan to Myanmar. And if we can't figure out how to deal with it, we're in for a very rough century. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's crisis isn't just about oil or Maduro's incompetence, it's about the unraveling of the entire regional security architecture that the US spent the better part of a century constructing. The Monroe Doctrine, the Rio Treaty, the OAS, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, all of these were supposed to ensure that Latin America remained a zone of US influence, where coups and dictatorships were either American-backed or American-removed. But that system is now in tatters, and Venezuela is the clearest proof of its failure. Take the Lima Group, for example. Back in 2017, a dozen Latin American countries, along with Canada, banded together to isolate Maduro diplomatically, recognizing Juan Guaido as interim president in 2019. It was a bold move, the kind of regional solidarity that Washington had been pushing for since the Cold War. But by 2023, the Lima Group had collapsed. Mexico, Argentina, and Colombia, three of the most important countries in the region, had all abandoned Guaidó, either because they saw him as a U.S. puppet or because they simply couldn't afford to keep antagonizing Maduro. The OAS, meanwhile, has been reduced to a talking shop, with its Secretary General, Luis Almagro, spending more time tweeting about Ukraine than actually addressing the hemisphere's crises. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. no longer has the leverage to impose its will in Latin America, and the region's leaders know it. When the Biden administration tried to revive the idea of a democratic transition in Venezuela in 2022, offering sanctions relief in exchange for free elections, Maduro didn't just reject the deal, he laughed at it. He knew that the U.S. was desperate to lower oil prices ahead of the midterms, and he knew that China and Russia would keep propping him up regardless. So he played for time, releasing a handful of political prisoners and allowing a few opposition figures to campaign, just enough to make the U.S. look like it was doing something. And it worked. By 2023, the U.S. had quietly dropped its demands for regime change and started negotiating directly with Maduro's government on energy deals, effectively recognizing his legitimacy. Let me explain why this matters. For decades, the U.S. operated under the assumption that if it applied enough pressure, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, even the occasional covert operation, it could force a change in behavior from rogue regimes. But that playbook doesn't work anymore, because the world has changed. Sanctions? Maduro's government has learned to live with them, thanks to Chinese and Russian trade networks, cryptocurrency, and a thriving black market. Diplomatic isolation? Venezuela now has more embassies in Latin America than it did before the crisis, thanks to countries like Brazil and Colombia prioritizing pragmatism over principle. Covert operations? The last time the U.S. tried something like that, remember the 2020 Bay of Piglets fiasco, where a ragtag group of mercenaries tried to invade Venezuela and capture Maduro. It ended in humiliation. The real problem is that the U.S. is still thinking in Cold War terms, where every crisis is a zero-sum game between democracy and authoritarianism. But in the 21st century, the game is different. China doesn't care about democracy, it cares about access to Venezuela's oil and rare earth minerals. Russia doesn't care about human rights, it cares about having a military foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And the US? It cares about stability, but only when it affects its own interests, like when Venezuelan migrants start showing up at the Texas border or when oil prices spike. The result is a policy that lurches between indifference and intervention, with no clear strategy beyond hoping that Maduro will somehow just go away. So what are the alternatives? There are really only three, and none of them are good. The first is the status: keep the sanctions in place, keep recognizing Guaidó's shadow government, and hope that economic pressure eventually forces Maduro to negotiate. The problem with this approach is that it's been tried for nearly a decade, and all it's done is deepen Venezuela's collapse. The country's GDP has shrunk by 75% since 2013, hyperinflation has destroyed the currency, and more than 7 million people have fled the country. Sanctions have made life harder for ordinary Venezuelans, but they haven't weakened Maduro's grip on power. If anything, they've made him more dependent on his foreign backers, who are happy to step in and fill the void. The second alternative is a negotiated transition, where Maduro agrees to step down in exchange for amnesty and sanctions relief. This is what the US and the opposition have been pushing for, but it's a fantasy. Maduro has no incentive to negotiate his own exit, because he knows that any transition would likely end with him in The Hague or in a Venezuelan prison. The only way a deal like this happens is if the military turns on him, and right now, the generals have no reason to do that. They're making too much money from corruption, drug trafficking, and gold mining. And even if Maduro were to leave, what comes next? The opposition is fractured, the economy is in ruins, and the country's institutions are hollowed out. The most likely outcome is a power vacuum, which would either lead to a military junta or a prolonged civil conflict. The third alternative is the one no one in Washington wants to talk: containment. Except that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not in the short term, and focus on mitigating the spillover effects of Venezuela's collapse. That means working with neighboring countries to manage the refugee crisis, cracking down on the drug trade and illegal mining that's fueling corruption, and finding ways to engage with Maduro's government without legitimizing it. It's not pretty, and it's not ideal, but it's the only realistic option left. Here's the thing about: it's not a solution, it's a holding pattern. It's what the US did with Cuba for 60 years, and it's what it's doing with North Korea now. The goal isn't to fix the problem, it's to prevent it from getting worse. And in Venezuela's case, that might be the best we can hope for. But let's be containment is a band-aid, not a cure. Venezuela's crisis is a symptom of a much larger problem, the failure of the international system to address state collapse in the 21st century. The UN is paralyzed by great power rivalry, the OAS is irrelevant, and the US is too distracted by its own domestic divisions to lead. Meanwhile, China and Russia are filling the void, offering loans, investment, and political support to regimes that the West has written off. If you want to know what the future of global governance looks like, just look at a country where the rules don't apply, where the institutions don't work, and where the only thing that matters is raw power. So why does any of this matter to you, sitting in your living room reading this? Because Venezuela is a warning. It's a preview of what happens when a country's institutions collapse, when its economy implodes, and when the international community can't agree on how to respond. And it's not just Venezuela. Haiti is already there. Sudan is heading in that direction. Myanmar is a mess. Even countries like Lebanon and Sri Lanka are teetering on the edge. The 21st century is going to be defined by state failure, and if we don't figure out how to deal with it, we're going to see a lot more Venezuelas, countries that were once stable, even prosperous, reduced to chaos and despair. The question: what are we going to do about it? Are we going to keep pretending that sanctions and moral condemnations are enough? Are we going to keep outsourcing our foreign policy to regional allies who don't share our interests? Or are we going to admit that the old ways of doing things don't work anymore, and that we need a new approach, one that's based on realism, not ideology? I don't have the answers. But I know if we don't start asking the right questions, Venezuela won't be the last crisis we fail to solve. It'll just be the first.